Welcome to Jivology, a channel dedicated to making concepts in biology simple, easy to understand, and interesting. Today we are going to look at a very crucial process called pollination. So, pollination is a process where the male gamete, which is present inside the pollen, is transferred from the anther to the stigma, which is a part in the female reproductive organ in case of flowering plants, and this leads to fertilization. If this is too complicated to understand, let's break this definition into four parts. 1. It's a process. 2. There is a transfer of pollen from where the anther to where the stigma. All these things happen only in the flowering plants. Now, when I say it's a very crucial process, why do we say so? That's because only when pollination happens, it can lead to sexual reproduction where there is a fusion of male and female gametes. Only when there is a fusion of male and female gametes, seeds and fruits will develop. Right? So sexual reproduction in plants occur when the pollen from an anther is transferred to the stigma, and this process is known as pollination. Let us quickly revise the parts of the flower for you to absorb this definition a little better. In our previous video where we saw the parts of flower in detail, we have seen that there are four different whorls in the flower. Some are the the essential whorls, and the others are non-essential whorls. Like the sepal and petal are non-essential whorls. The essential whorls are the androecium and gynoecium. If you want to go back and revise the entire chapter on the parts of flower, I would highly recommend you do that. Please go back and visit the video and then come back to this. Otherwise, we're just going to quickly look at these essential parts for now. Stamen, which is the androecium, is the male reproductive part. It is made up of anther and filament, and it is inside the anther that you find the pollen grains. Pistil or the gynoecium is the female reproductive part. It comprises of stigma, style, and ovary. Stigma is the sticky area, style is the tube-like structure, and ovary contains ovules. Stigma is where the pollen grains are received. The pollen tube develops and grows inside the style, and it reaches the ovary where there are ovules present inside. Yeah. Now let us look at the types of pollination. Depending on where the anther and the stigma are present, pollination can be of two types: self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is where the anther and the stigma are in the same plant, whereas cross-pollination is one where the anther and stigma are present in different plants. Self-pollination again can be of two types: autogamy and geitonogamy. Auto means self, gamy means marriage. These are derived from Greek words, so which means that here there is a marriage happening to the self, which means that both the anther and the stigma are present in the same flower. The way to remember these definitions is that you consider the first part of it as the general definition, that is, pollination is transfer of pollen from anther to stigma, and then this red portion is what is going to be the differentiator. So in case of autogamy, which is a type of self-pollination, there is transfer of pollen from anther to stigma of the same flower, like this. So from here, the anther, it goes to the stigma of the same flower. Now coming to geitonogamy. This is a Latin word, geiton, which means neighbor, and gamy means marriage. So here again, the basic definition remains the same, that is transfer of pollen from anther to stigma, but the specific definition is that it is of another flower on the same plant. So since it is in the same plant, it is a type of self-pollination, but in case of geitonogamy, the anther and stigma are in the neighboring flowers, something like this. So both of these flowers belong to the same plant, whereas the movement of the pollen happens from the androecium of one flower to the gynoecium of the another flower, but in the same plant. Now cross-pollination is also known as allogamy, where allo is a Greek word meaning different. Gamy, as we now know, is marriage. So here the transfer of pollen happens from anther to stigma of another flower of a different plant, but of the same species, which means that there are two different plants which have two different flowers, but these plants are of the same species, and here the pollen is transferred from the anther of one plant to the stigma of another flower in a different plant of the same species. Now after pollination, these stamens and petals, they dry and fall off. Sometimes the calyx may also fall off, or sometimes it is persistent in the fruit, and we see it attached, for example in case of tomato. Now since flowers cannot move on their own, they need the help of certain agents which will help the pollination to happen. So these agents are known as pollinators, and for attracting these pollinators, the flowers undergo certain adaptations in their structure. In the first example, the agent is wind. So wind is the pollinator, and wind is the one which carries the pollen from the anther to the stigma. So these flowers where wind is the pollinating agent are known as anemophilous flowers. Anemos is a Greek word which means wind, and philous means loving. So these flowers love wind to carry the pollen from them to the stigma. For this, the flowers are small. They are borne on a long stalk so that when the wind blows, the flowers are able to move, and then they can produce a large number of pollen grains. That is because a lot of these pollen grains might get lost when the wind is carrying them. Example of wind pollination is paddy plants. The second agent is insects. So flowers where pollination happens with the help of insects are known as entomophilous flowers. Philous, as we now know, is loving, and entomon is a Greek word for insect. These flowers are very showy, they are brightly colored because they have to attract the insects towards them. They contain scent or they contain nectar, and to pick this nectar is why these insects come to these flowers, and when they do, the pollen grains stick on the body of the insect, and as the insect flies from one flower to another, they carry the pollen grains along with them and deposit them on the stigma of another flower. Example of insect pollination is marigold and hibiscus. The third agent for pollination is water. So those flowers which take the help of water for pollination are known as hydrophilous flowers. Hydro is a Greek word for water, and philous, as we all saw, means loving. Now, water can be an agent for aquatic plants, that is, plants which grow in water. Just like wind, even in case of water, a large number of pollen grains are produced because we do not know how many will get lost on the way. And these pollen grains have a specific gravity which is same as that of water. So this ensures that the pollen grains do not get drowned, but they stay afloat on top. Example of such kind of pollination is in case of plants like Vallisneria. Since we saw that there are two different types of pollination, an obvious question can come to mind as to which is better of the two. Now, both self-pollination and cross-pollination have their own advantages and disadvantages. Let's look at self-pollination first. The major advantage of self-pollination is that there is consistency, there is genetic stability, there is self-sufficiency, and it is cost-effective, which means that consistently you are able to get the same type of flowers, same kind of fruit. That is because there is a genetic stability. There is no mix-up of genetic material. It's the same genetic material. So consistently you are getting the same type of output or produce from these plants. These plants are self-sufficient. They do not depend on any agents. So even if the agents are absent, these plants can still go ahead and undergo their pollination and move on with the fertilization and production of fruits and seeds. This is a very cost-effective process for the plant, because in case of self-pollination, since the pollination is happening within themselves, the flowers need not be showy. There is no need of having brightly colored, big, attractive petals. There is no need of producing huge quantities of pollen. So it is less taxing for the plant. However, the disadvantages of self-pollination is that just the reverse of this genetic stability. There is a lack of genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is very important because that is what helps in case of for any organism to adapt to changes. And like they say, survival of the fittest. Only those organisms in a species which are able to survive the changes are the ones which are able to live longer. So genetic diversity is very, very important, which is not possible in case of self-pollination. In fact, sometimes, since it's the same genetic material which is interacting, there is a possibility of inbreeding depression, which means that certain recessive characters can get surfaced. Here, because there is no diversity, because there are no variations, the plants do not have much adaptability. So if there are any changes in the surroundings or in any way, these plants will not be able to adapt because they will not be able to change. Generation after generation, they produce the same kind of plants or same kind of offsprings as that of the parent. So there is hardly any genetic improvement in these plants. So that is the disadvantage of self-pollination. If you look at cross-pollination, exactly whatever is the disadvantage of self-pollination are the advantages of cross-pollination. We can see that there are a lot of new varieties that can be produced because of the genetic diversity that happens when the genes and chromosomes of different plants come together. The offsprings are generally healthier, and there are a lot of good quality seeds which are produced. However, the disadvantage again is that we are not sure whether pollination will happen or not, because it is dependent on an agent, and it also depends on other environmental criteria which will help the pollen to get transferred to the stigma. So pollination is not always sure, and while this pollination happens, a lot of pollen get dropped, get drowned, and a lot of pollen is wasted. So a lot has to be produced and a lot gets wasted. And then it is taxing on the flower, because the flowers have to be large, showy, they have to have nectar, they have to have some scent to attract these insect or bat as pollinators. If we look around us in nature, we will see that there are various adaptations in the plants which facilitate cross-pollination. And this shows that nature prefers cross-pollination. Let's see some of these adaptations. The first one is herkogamy. This is a phenomenon where the flowers have some kind of a mechanical barrier on the stigma which prevents the self-pollination from happening. Example is calotropis, where there is a structure called gynostagium, which is a modification on the stigma, and that prevents self-pollination. The second type is dichogamy. Now, sexual reproduction can happen only when both the male and the female gametes are matured. In case of dichogamy, the pollen and stigma of the flower mature at different times, and hence self-pollination is not possible. Example is salvia. Then there are some plants where we see self-incompatibility, which means that even if the mature pollen falls on the receptive stigma, they fail to bring about pollination. So example is Drosera. Then the fourth situation is malesterility, where the plants produce pollen grains, but these pollen grains are not functional, whereas the female part is normal and functioning normally. So in such plants, only after cross-pollination, they are able to produce seeds. Example is cotton. Then we have plants which are unisexual and dioecious. So cross-pollination happens always in those plants which are unisexual and which are dioecious. So which means that the male and the female flowers are on separate plants. Such a situation is known as dioecism. We can see that in case of papaya and cucumber, where you have male flowers and you have female flowers separately. So there is no possibility of pollination to happen within the same flower. The next kind of a adaptation is heterostyly. So heterostyly means that the stamen and the pistil are of different lengths. Suppose if the stamen is small and the pistil is long or tall, the possibility of the pollen to fall on the stigma will be very, very difficult. So such kind of plants are display the phenomenon called heterostyly. Examples are primula and linum. So with this, we come to an end of this topic called pollination. Let's look at few questions. Do stay back and revise these questions. This will help you to absorb the concepts better, and you will be able to understand and see and test your own understanding for sure. Let's look at the question and answer sections. Thank you for watching. Please do subscribe, like, and share the video with your friends. Do mention your feedback in the comments. If you have any questions, doubts, queries, clarifications, feel free to mention in the comment box and I shall be glad to respond. See you in the next video where we are going to talk about pollen grains, the germination, the structure of ovules, and finally the process of fertilization.